Welcome to the Resource-Based View, Part 2, The Rise and Fall of Sony. We're going to need to do things a little bit differently today. I'm going to have to call up my trusty time machine. We know that it's currently 2020, so I've got 2020 on my dial gauge, but we need to set it to a more fun time to properly understand Sony. And I'm going to pick 1982. Okay, I'll see you on the flip side. All right, welcome to 1982. I see my collar isn't appropriately popped. There we go. Sony is the undisputed king of consumer electronics. I was going to say that Sony is the Apple of the 1980s, and I've got a reason for that. But it turns out that Apple was pretty awesome in the 1980s, so perhaps Apple is the Apple of the 1980s. Because Sony was the leader in almost every segment of consumer electronics. They invented the Walkman, the portable cassette player, and by 1981 they had released the second generation Walkman and a whole suite of other top consumer product lines, portable televisions. I mean, by 1981 standards, this was pretty much the future. This was like flying cars and hoverboards. Today we're doing the resource-based view. In fact, this is part 2 of my resource-based view series on YouTube. And there are 5 tests, so we're going to go over them one at a time, and we're going to apply them to Sony in the 1980s, and then look at what went right and what went wrong for Sony today. Because my hypothesis here is that 1980 Sony should be 2020 Apple. Sony should be the big company out there. And instead, Sony's a great company, but it's not worth a lot of money relative to its electronics peers like Apple. And so it perhaps didn't live up to the expectation that people might have had for it in the 1980s. So Inimitability, what did Sony do well, in the early 80s or later 80s? And there's one thing they did absolutely the best, and that was the engineering. So they designed the products, and they're very good at product design. There we go. And then they also engineered the products. So they were ahead in terms of their research and development, and they translated that in many cases into better production costs. And then brand name. So not only could they be creative and have an idea of what the next consumer product should be, they were then able to design it, make it sexy, make it reasonably priced. Sony was never about being cheap. And so over time they developed their brand name, Sony being synonymous with quality. So these are all assets, inimitable assets that Sony has that allow them to outcompete their peers, peers such as Toshiba or Sanyo or Iowa, etc. So durability. So Sony had some durable and some non-durable assets. So as the first bullet point here says, all resources or capabilities will dry up over time and need investment to be renewed, such as brand, such as firm capabilities, intellectual property. And here capabilities are research and development, the ability to create or be creative, etc. So when we ask how quickly does the resource depreciate, there are a couple of answers. So in some cases, Sony created a stream of intellectual property that outcompeted all components for long periods of time. But at the same time, the durability of Sony's core capability, being creative, having better research and development, they were only a few years ahead of their rivals at best on any given product. So the durability of that asset, that is their ability to be creative, to have better research and development, is going to depreciate. It's teetering on a knife's edge. They have a lot of potential to make money for every new product category that they create, but every time that product category gets saturated with competitors, then their ability to profit declines. So this will sound very similar for test number 3, which is appropriability. Who captures the value that the resource creates? So let's imagine a world where there are no portable cassette players. Then Sony, once they manufacture the Walkman, is essentially a monopolist. They've got the market for a short period of time before someone creates a competitor. So let's just say that was 1982. Then Sony's appropriability would be very, very high. They've got their own costs to develop, the cost to manufacture, but they can set a price for the product well above that, whatever the market will bear, honestly, and they can appropriate that extra profit. Of course, as competitors come in, that's Iowa on the bottom left, Panasonic on the bottom right, then the level of appropriability will go down, and it will go down in proportion to the number of competitors that Sony has, and in proportion to the advantage that Sony had created in terms of manufacturing capabilities, economies of scale, etc. Probably gets a bit complex for us here, but I think that's a simplistic way of illustrating how the appropriability would work in one product category. All right, test number 4, substitutability. Can a unique resource be trumped by a different resource? And yes, kinda. Is there substitutability? You go, yeah, sure. I guess I could have a boombox and play my Fresh Prince and DJ Jazzy Jeff. Got a portable radio. I could probably pick up my Depeche Mode or Duran Duran. Then I could use my Panasonic CD player to listen to Boyz II Men. Test number 5, competitive superiority. And this is the question of, does Sony as a company have the overall capabilities to outcompete their direct competitors? Things like Sanyo, Panasonic, Toshiba, Iowa, as I mentioned before. So we don't have an easy way of answering this question. Test number 5 is always a very hard question to answer. But does Sony have a better overall set of capabilities than their competitors? And the answer is probably yes. So just to distill this, what was Sony's magic? They had engineering, they had the best product design, they had the best brand by a mile within the electronic space, and they had good manufacturing and operations. And so what happened? Why isn't Sony in 2020 the Apple of 2020? And Sony hasn't really lost any of these capabilities. I mean, Sony's still producing the sexy products, the TVs, the PlayStation. I think they're coming out with the PlayStation 5 pretty soon. And the cameras. Essentially every high-end smartphone uses a Sony camera chip. So we know from the article that resources lose value, rareness, inimitability over time. And we also know that firms must continuously invest in resources to maintain their competitive advantage. So again, Sony 1979 versus Sony today, what's different? My argument here is that Sony has diluted their main core competency. In fact, this could almost be a core competency argument. In the 80s, Sony's core competency was developing the electronics. In the 90s, for whatever reason, and there are books written about this, Sony went into media heavily. They bought Sony Pictures, they bought Sony Music, and they probably own a few dozen distribution outlets in the various media, TV, movies, and music. The focus and the resources that went to, because don't kid yourself, let's say they bought Sony Music, well, that means that the best executives had to go over and try to figure out how to run Sony Music. The best executives had to go run Sony Pictures. Well, what does that mean? You've lost your best executives within the main Sony corporation, Sony Electronics, and you've got a whole new line of products to develop. What happens? Well, Sony doesn't have that creative edge going forward. In 1980, they were conceptualizing, we need the next Walkman. We need the next portable television. In the 2000s, let's just go ahead and do what our other competitors have done. We're no longer going to be a creative leader. During that same time period, Apple, the Steve Jobs era, Apple was conceiving and developing entirely new product categories. The iPod, iPhone, again, while the iPhone didn't break ground for any particular technology, the usability, the App Store, all of these were conceived as strong innovations within a group of product categories. Those were the kind of innovations that Sony had lost. 1980 Sony could have done that. 2000 Sony clearly wasn't. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'll leave you with a meme about the Sony Walkman. Have a very, very 1980s day.